The following is a Coin 6 News special presentation.
Tonight on Town Hall.
So he went and found some Oxy and Xanax at work. And unfortunately, they weren't Oxy and Xanax, they were fentanyl. And so he died immediately.
It's a killer sweeping across Oregon.
In the middle of this, Jennifer found a small bag next to Cal, and it had blue pills in it with a M30 on them. She gave them to the first responders and almost immediately said that looks like fentanyl. If you're the praying type of people, you should start praying.
Fentanyl flooding across the state, bringing death, destroying families, and leaving first responders overwhelmed.
We're stretched thin to the max. Our fire department's stretched to the max. Our PD is stretched to the max. In fact, we had to call in the county sheriff's office to come in and help administer Narcan because we were running short.
And while fentanyl is a new threat, Oregon continues to drown with methamphetamine. And a more potent meth that devastates lives, fuels an already out-of-control homeless problem, is filling hospitals and jails to the breaking point.
This is not the meth that we used to use, right? It's almost immediately creates psychosis, and it's so dirt cheap.
And is a driving force behind a stunning rise in crime and vandalism.
The vandalism and the violence and the just blatant drug use in the area has been terrifying for a lot of people.
We basically have campers and drug dealing within distance of preschools.
Oregon ranks highest in the nation for illicit drug use and dead last in access to drug treatment. It's the main reason voters passed Measure 110, decriminalizing certain amounts of drugs for personal use with the promise of addiction treatment. But critics say it's not working and is only throwing gasoline on an already out-of-control problem.
Measure 110 was just a complete mistake.
But supporters say, give Measure 110 time to work. Let's tweak it, make it better. Those are the issues we'll explore tonight as we look for solutions and answers.
This is a Coin 6 Town Hall, a state of pain, Oregon's drug crisis.
And welcome to our Town Hall program. I'm Jeff Gianola. Oregon is in a state of pain, and the people gathered here tonight have lived that pain. They've seen it up close. Some have suffered the pain of losing a loved one, a child, to drugs and addiction. Others have gone through the frustration of trying to get treatment for an addictive loved one. But all say it's time for that pain to stop. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I want to thank you at home for watching. And I want you to take a look at this video. This is a young man named Taylor Martinek. Taylor was a loving son, a brother. He was an outstanding athlete, excelled in football at Jesuit High School, later at Portland State. Taylor suffered a shoulder injury his senior year in school, later in college, had surgery, and was prescribed oxycodone for pain, which led to a dependence on opioids, something Taylor struggled with the rest of his life. On January 17th, 2017, Taylor took what he thought was an oxycodone pill. It was a counterfeit pill supplied by a drug dealer, and it was fentanyl, laced with fentanyl. Taylor had no idea the pill he took was a lethal dose of fentanyl. Taylor Martinek was only 24 years old. Taylor's parents join us here tonight, Brian and Brenda. I want to thank you both for being here and sharing what is such a painful story. You've shared this before with us. Brian, you were getting ready to go to a father-daughter dance that night when you got the news. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, it was my youngest daughter's first father-daughter dance was going to be when we got the phone call that every parent fears. We got a call from Taylor's roommates that had come home that day and found him unresponsive in his apartment in Beaverton. We entered into that pain that you described in the nightmare that no parent wants to have to really live through, but we all fear.
Brian, you've been member of the Portland Police Bureau. You were for years. You were a police captain. You were an assistant chief. You later became a chief of police in a department. You were well aware of fentanyl. Brenda, you were so active in the school system. You were aware of what young people were into. How did that make you feel as parents when you found out your son was addicted to opioids and then later died of a fentanyl overdose?
I mean, it's your worst fear. And Taylor had been educated. We did all the preventative measures. Addiction is a horrible, awful disease, and people in recovery relapse, and that's what Taylor did.
In Taylor's case, he thought he was taking an opioid pill. I want to show a picture up here. He thought he was taking a prescription opioid medication. It had the pharmacy mark on it, the manufacturer mark. It was the same color. It looked like the same thing. You can't tell the difference. Pharmacists can tell you absolutely can't tell the difference. This wasn't necessarily an overdose. He was poisoned. Your son was poisoned.
That's exactly what it is. He was very familiar with what prescription Xanax and oxycodone looked like, and he couldn't obviously tell the difference. He was aware of the deadly nature of fentanyl, and he took one pill of the pills that he purchased. He had been in recovery. He had been sober for about 5 months, and he relapsed. And this was the one time that he wasn't going to survive the consequences of that.
Back then, we were just hearing about fentanyl in 2017
Right.
when Taylor died. There are folks on the street who don't take a counterfeit pill. They know they're taking fentanyl. We know it comes from China to Mexico, where then the drug cartels send it up here. Sometimes it's counterfeit pills, in Taylor's case. Other times, drug users are just using it on the streets. I want to introduce Sergeant Aaron Schmautz from Portland Police and the head of the Portland Police Association. Aaron, thank you for being here. What are we seeing on the streets now compared to 2017 when fentanyl was just being talked about?
I mean, the real difficulty, I was talking to one of my officers last night. They made an arrest of someone who had 7,500 pills. And just the volume of narcotics that are on our street, I mean, when you create a vacuum, you create an environment where it's difficult to enforce. It's difficult to go and do the work knowing that the sentencing mechanisms are difficult, and also the incentive, the ability for law enforcement to go and do the amount of work it takes to interdict this kind of thing. It just creates kind of a perverse incentive for people to go and prey on people who are addicts.
Crystal Delahanty is with PDX St. Love. They do great work with the homeless at the street level. You yourself are in recovery. You see this every day. You told me the city smells like fentanyl. What do you mean when you say that?
Our staff is concerned about the smell of plastic that they're smelling. It's brand new. We've been doing this for 6 years, so we recognize the difference. We're talking about, when you enter your home, please take your clothes off. We don't know how that's going to affect your children. Swabbing our noses out at the end of our outreach. We have been on outreach and meeting with people where we've ended up walking through a cloud of fentanyl that someone has billowed out, and had to, go back to our cars, change our clothes.
Mike Marshall from Oregon Recovers is here. And Mike, when we talk about fentanyl, we also talk about meth. Before fentanyl, we started even knowing what it was. Oregon was drowning in meth. But you say there's a new meth out there. Meth nowadays is much more powerful.
Absolutely. It's important to know that we're the #1 meth users in the country. We're #1. We have 18.2% of the population is addicted to some substance, namely alcohol, but meth being second in all of that. Way more Taylors than there are folks on the streets, right? And so that's the context. But this new meth is just, it immediately, I used meth for 10 years, 15 years ago. It was like my grandfather's meth, so to speak. It was just, it was homegrown, and I could get off of it, and 3 days later, I could participate in a conversation, and ultimately, I was able to go to treatment 3 days after I stopped using and participate fully in treatment. Today, this meth is creating a level of psychosis and permanent or long-term damage that really makes it very difficult for someone a week off, a month off, even maybe 3 months off to begin to participate in the group therapy and the treatment protocols that we have in place.
Okay, a little bit later, we're going to talk about something that both Brian and Brenda are pushing, Taylor's Law. We're going to talk about that later in the broadcast, and I want you to stay tuned for that. But right now, I want to go to Dr. Andy Mendenhall from Central City Concern. Dr. Andy, what is it that makes this so powerful, the addiction, whether it's fentanyl or meth? What is it?
So, Jeff, when we think about, we prefer the term substance use disorder, we're really talking about the reward parts of the brain becoming hijacked. So the substance of abuse is resulting in the release of a really significant amount of brain chemicals that feel good. And what we're seeing now in the drug supply, when we're talking about fentanyl, we're talking about something that's 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin or morphine. And with respect to methamphetamine, it's never been more pure, more potent, or dangerous. So the levels of reward are something that human brains have never seen before. That makes it harder for folks to get into recovery. It makes it harder for folks to stay in recovery because that reward imprint is so strong.
And that's just difficult to kick, isn't it?
It makes it more of a challenge because that imprint can be very deep. Recovery absolutely happens, but as Mike was saying earlier, it might take time for folks to clear cognitively, to be able to participate in the types of treatment, the types of services that we know are going to help people get into recovery and have a recovery that really starts to stick and allow folks to have that successful outcome we're all hoping for.
I want everyone to meet Emily Green. Emily's a journalist. She wrote some incredible articles on Oregon's addiction crisis and how we get out of it for the Lund Report. This was a fellowship that you had to help get these articles out, Emily?
That's right. It was through a fellowship sponsored by the Association of Healthcare Journalists and the Commonwealth Fund.
Emily, you say in your writings that this whole addiction crisis is crippling everything else. It's sabotaging everything else. When you say that, what are you talking about?
So we really dug into how the addiction care system is functioning in Oregon, and we found that methamphetamine in particular is inflaming a whole lot of pre-existing crises that we have across the state with homelessness, the capacity issues at Oregon State Hospital, and shortages in the mental health system. That's because when you have a situation with methamphetamine combined in folks who are also experiencing the trauma of homelessness, that can, people living in that constant state of hypervigilance, lacking in sleep, and when you combine that with meth use, you can see cases of psychosis happening when it otherwise wouldn't. And you can see that also happening with people who have genetic predisposition for mental illness. I want to be clear, not everybody who uses meth has a psychotic break.
And you also say the addiction crisis is filling our hospital beds, our jails, and it's a revolving circle. People get out of jail, they go back on the street. There's nothing to stop that cycle. They get into the state hospital beds. Now they're using beds that other people who really need those beds could use, but they're cycled back. And it's hard to break that cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, because what we're seeing is when folks go to Oregon State Hospital who are using meth, it is usually because they're being restored for court competency. So they're not there long enough to get addiction care. They're just getting mental health care. And when they're going to EDs, which we're seeing increasing rates, more than 16,000 ED visits in urban areas of Oregon in 2021 alone. They're usually just in and out in a couple days. And like Mike said, it can take a long time to really clear from long-term meth use. So it is jamming up the system and taking those beds away from other folks who need them.
I want to get to our Coin 6 reporter and a great colleague of mine, Elise Haas, who's over here. And Elise, who are you with?
I'm with Terrence Moses, and I interviewed Terrence a couple of weeks ago because he owns a nonprofit called Neighbors Helping Neighbors. And he is out there with volunteers literally going to campsites and cleaning up their trash and engaging with these people. And because he goes to places where people normally don't go, he sees things and does things people normally don't do. So you have experienced and witnessed people overdosing on the streets, and you've literally brought them back to life with Narcan. Walk us through that experience. What is that like?
Well, first of all, it's a traumatizing experience for someone walking up and witnessing that. But when you're dealing with a person that literally thinks his problems are above everything else, and that this is his way out, and this is the way to escape from his reality, it's really troublesome. They really believe that this is their end, this is their last hope. This will have them to get out of their own reality and to get some clarity back into what they're trying to gain.
After you use that Narcan and you bring someone back, I mean, when you're engaging with these people, do they seem like they are ready to receive, recovery and treatment?
No, they're not ready. And the reason they're not ready is because they've been doing this for so long, and it's becoming their everything. And they haven't hit that place yet where they're willing to accept help yet, but they can clearly tell you that no, and they'll clearly tell you that they're not ready. But they also will clearly tell you that thank you.
I was just going to ask that. That's it. I see a familiar face sitting behind you.
This is Lisa Schroeder, and she is a business owner in downtown Portland, running Mother's Bistro, which is a beloved restaurant. But downtown has struggled for a myriad of reasons, and you're down there every day. So can you walk us through what your experience is like as a business owner and what the impacts to your day-to-day life are?
Well, my eyes opened when I moved from parking inside a garage to the quadrant right behind Voodoo Donuts and Dante's, and that's when I saw it's meth TV. It's a meth supermarket. And people buy and they sell and then they smoke and then they do crazy things. And it is making people insane. And I really feel that it is the main problem for our city. I know everybody blankets it in homelessness, and I feel the poor homeless that are really down and out are being blamed for what is truly a drug problem. And it's the drug addicts that are doing all these crimes, that are creating this insanity that's happening on the streets of downtown Portland, broken windows, vandalism, all that. It's people whose minds are just not right because they are obviously on something.
And I see City Councilor Renee Gonzalez. How do you weigh in on that, Renee?
Well, we heard for 2 years of declining livability in the city. It's something that you don't feel safe for your children to go to parks. You don't feel safe for your partner to take the MAX train. You don't feel safe for your senior parent to walk down the street. And it's real. You feel it every single day in the city of Portland, in some of our best neighborhoods, most working class neighborhoods in downtown. So as a city, we've got to put it out absolutely in the center. Where our role is to partner at times with the county, with the state on these issues, also to be strong advocates for livability and for small businesses that are struggling with the after effects of this, but also to protect. We are the spear in many ways in confronting these challenges, and we cannot do it alone, but ultimately city government is where the rubber really hits the road on a lot of these things. This is where the first ones people call when it's not going well, and we can't back away from that responsibility.
No. Lisa, just quickly, how is it for a business owner downtown these days with the addiction crisis?
Well, we have struggled from time immemorial. 23 years in business, we have seen addiction come and go, but it's getting out of hand. Since Measure 110 has passed, we have seen people coming into the city that aren't even citizens of Oregon. They're coming from everywhere. They're setting up shop. We're seeing RVs set up their little market, and then they pay for the tents around them so they have their customers built right in. We're just seeing it's a whole industry that is happening.
You mentioned Measure 110, and when we come back, we said Oregon ranks first in addiction, dead last in addiction treatment. Isn't that what Measure 110 was supposed to fix? Where are the treatment beds? Where are the millions of dollars going? We'll look into that when we come back.
Starting today, small amounts of illegal drugs will now be decriminalized in the state of Oregon.
November 2020, Oregon voters passed Measure 110, the Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act.
If someone is now caught with small amounts of drugs like heroin, cocaine, or ecstasy, they will now receive a ticket rather than getting arrested and put in jail.
That ticket is dismissed if they call a drug addiction screening hotline.
The ultimate goal would be to get people with addiction into treatment.
$300 million collected through the state cannabis tax is redirected every 2 years to addiction treatment and harm reduction.
More people are alive in Marion and Lane County today because the HIV Alliance used Measure 110 funds to directly reverse over 500 overdoses.
But the state has been criticized for the slow rollout of funds and lack of oversight.
We were more focused on getting the money out the door and letting the providers tell us how they were going to spend the money.
That, coupled with inadequate infrastructure, has some wondering if Measure 110 was a mistake.
Up to 4 months for people to get a residential treatment bed. And that's unacceptable.
We as a state do not have adequate treatment capacity for those with substance abuse issues.
When the voters of Oregon passed Measure 110, we did so because we wanted to change a policy in Oregon to improve the lives of people, to improve our communities. And in the years since, we haven't seen that play out.
Can what Oregon voters thought they approved be fixed? And welcome back to A State of Pain, Oregon's drug crisis. Is Measure 110 working? Is that what Oregon voters voted for? I want to share some information for you and take a look at this. As of January, 4,037 citations have been issued. More than 2/3 failed to show up for court. There have been 600 calls to the hotline, and that includes calls from treatment providers, lawyers, and others calling about services. But only 166 have completed health screenings. And you talk to some of those people who handled the treatment, and they said those who asked for treatment, the few that did, there was no treatment available. They had to wait in a line or a queue for treatment. I want to introduce Anthony Johnson, who was one of the co-petitioners of Measure 110. So Anthony, when I have information like that, is it working on how you hoped it would work?
To take 2 years for the $300 million that goes to life-saving treatments for harm reduction, to save lives, to prevent overdoses, the treatment recovery programs that have been funded, we needed that to get out sooner. And so for that to take 2 years, that definitely wasn't what we wanted, and definitely not what the voters wanted as well.
So you would be in favor of improving Measure 110, especially when it comes to treatment?
Definitely. The audit by the Secretary of State, definitely support that, support future audits to make sure that this program can work effectively. You know, with COVID hitting the state, I think the Oregon Health Authority had a lot on their hands. And so the rollout of the money and the infrastructure around that took too long. And we need to work on the program to improve upon it, but criminalizing people for their addiction, small amounts of substances, is not the way to go.
Well, you're sitting right next to the Secretary of State. Shemia Fagan joined us right now. Shemia, this is, before we get into the audit you did, this is personal for you. You have a personal experience with addiction like a lot of us do. Raise your hand if you have someone, how addiction has touched your lives in this audience. Almost everyone has raised their hand. And Shemia, tell your story.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and it's really an honor to be with all of you today. In January of 2009, I was in my final winter break before going into my third year of law school, finishing law school, and I got a call from my mom's boss. My mom had been a bartender at the Glass House Tavern in Sandy on and off for 30 years, and I got a call from her boss that she had overdosed and that she was at the ICU at Portland Adventist Hospital. And so I went up there and for about a week sat by her bedside, and we had every expectation that she was going to, if she lived, that she was going to probably be permanently brain damaged. And because of how long she laid there passed out before any help was called, because her husband at the time was afraid he'd get in trouble if he called the police. And so they just left her there. And so she recovered somewhat miraculously, and my brothers and I moved her to Umatilla County and supported her while she got clean. And my mom had battled addiction on and off for my whole life. She'd been on meth and homeless in Portland. We had been to, her graduations at recoveries before, but this time she did get clean, and she passed away about 6 years later, but she'd been clean for all those 6 years.
And your brother had an addiction issue.
Yeah, my brother is still in recovery. He's actually involved with the Oxford House Network and living in recovery in Pendleton.
Let's talk about the audit. Part of your job as Secretary of State is to do audits to see if our tax dollars are being spent wisely. What did you find when you audited Measure 110?
Right, I mean, the audit is actually one of the biggest tools that we have to build trust with people, to make sure that the services that are supposed to be making a positive difference in people's lives are actually doing that. And when the voters passed Measure 110 with nearly 60% of the vote, in that was a requirement that the Secretary of State audit it. And so we did that, and we released that audit last month. And what it shows that the problem is similar to what Mr. Johnson said, which is that the program is not doing what it was supposed to do, that the data collection and then the cumbersome nature of the grant applications and lack of support from the Oregon Health Authority to the Oregon Oversight and Accountability Council, the lack of support that the providers need. The providers are out there, they want to provide these services, they want to help people get into treatment, and to have that money be bottled up in really, really cumbersome grant processes instead of getting out the door is as frustrating for Oregon voters as it was for those providers who want to help people and change lives.
Under Measure 110, is there enough incentive for the addicted person to seek treatment other than citation and call this number? I want everyone to listen to this. This is a man named Keith Humphreys. He's a professor at Stanford. He was also part of the addiction team during the Obama administration, advising them on addiction treatment. This is what he said when he testified to Oregon legislators about Measure 110. Take a listen to this.
Addicted people usually do not seek treatment and recovery without external pressure from family, friends, employers, healthcare providers, or the law. Why does this matter? It matters because Oregon has removed all legal pressure to stop drug use and seek treatment.
So, Anthony, when you hear that, do you think we need to do more to push the addicted person into it? We've decriminalized it. We get that. What do you say when you hear something like that?
Measure 110 decriminalized personal amounts. And so possessing larger amounts, selling, committing other crimes due to your addiction, those still remain illegal. So those laws need to be enforced. And the law enforcement mechanism to get people into treatment, is still there. People that possess under 1 gram of cocaine, 1 gram of other substances, they don't necessarily need their lives ruined to have their livelihood taken away, thrown in jail where their addiction issues could get worse to get the treatment they need. So does the law need to be enforced so that people who do commit other crimes seek the treatment, and the treatment needs to be there and available for them for sure?
Okay, I'm hearing Anthony say, let's not throw Measure 110 away. Let's at least tweak it and make it better. I hear that. I want to get back to Emily Green. Emily, the one thing that came out when we talked to all health professionals, people that deal with addiction, is there simply aren't enough treatment beds, and Measure 110 failed to provide those treatment beds. You just wrote a recent article about the gap. When we talk about the gap, what are we talking about, and what did you discover?
So the OHSU PSU School of Public Health recently did a gap analysis. They looked at the treatment system for addiction across the state. They found widespread shortages in every category, from prevention to workforce, residential treatment, detox. All in all, they found that Oregon's addiction care system is actually half the size it should be to meet the current demand.
You say it's even worse in rural counties.
That's right. I mean, in Portland, it means getting waitlisted, right? But I went out to Malheur County, where they don't have a detox. The closest one, the facility where you can go and have your drug withdrawal medically monitored, is in Pendleton. That's 3 hours away. They have outpatient treatment, but if you're experiencing homelessness and you attend outpatient treatment, as many do, there's not even an overnight shelter in Malheur County. The closest one is across the state line in Boise. So the shortages there are really extreme.
I want to get to Sharon Myron. Everyone knows Dr. Sharon Myron, Multnomah County Commissioner. And Sharon, you recently went with a group to Tucson to see what they call a stabilization center to stop this thing of people going to jail, back out on the streets. It was a 500-bed stabilization center, and you thought you could bring that idea back to Multnomah County here. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, so as an emergency physician, we see people coming into the emergency department for so many reasons, especially related to behavioral health, substance use disorder, and crisis. And we see people who cycle through our criminal justice system, our healthcare system, and our homeless system in this never-ending cycle of crisis. And what they're able to do in Pima County and Tucson was interrupt the cycle. And so it's a center that does triage, stabilization for people in crisis, and then whatever kind of management they need, and then referral to the right place, the right time, and the right treatment and recovery services.
And when you got back to Portland, you thought, this is a great idea, and you requested 110 funds. What happened then? And they said no.
Yes, there's a lot to the story, but essentially there was a group working on the Behavioral Health Emergency Coordination Network, another opportunity in the Portland metro area. And this group was a collaboration like I've never seen before of public safety folks, behavioral health leaders, consumers, people with lived experience, just across the gamut. And said, we're working together to create this system, starting with a sobering center. We would love your help. It is an essential, won't solve things, it's an essential component of the solution. And there were no Measure 110 dollars.
They didn't want to fund that, and it just seems like that makes sense. Let's get some comments from this thing. Crystal, when you hear something like that, what do you think about when it comes to a lack of detox and treatment beds?
I think about the multiple faces that I meet on a daily basis who are trying so hard to get off of, especially fentanyl, which is totally different than our heroin crisis that we endured before. They will go into detox with a hopeful heart and 5 days later be back out on the street and coming to one of our outreach events begging for a bed, and we can't find them one. And in the meantime, people are dying.
Mike, what do you comment on that when you hear that?
So absolutely, we've known this, we've been 50th in access to treatment for a long, long time. I do want to be the voice of optimism here in that one profound thing has changed. Kate Brown is no longer governor. This crisis was of her doing. She ran away from solving it as much as she could. Governor Kotek is the complete opposite type of person. She runs towards a problem. She's identified behavioral health and addiction as what she's hanging the success of her governorship on. And so we've already seen a profound change. Look how quickly she moved to change the leadership of the OLCC. She understands that alcohol is a driving force behind this larger addiction crisis. And then, of course, the crisis, their scandal unfolded. But the point is that with Measure 110, it's a great deal of money going into really profoundly important services. We're going to see another round of that funding going out next. Governor Kotek will make sure that the commission that's handing out that money is more strategic, more aligned with a larger state plan that Governor Brown ignored that was developed in 2020. We'll look at the opioid settlement money that's coming online. That will be aligned with Measure 110 funding. We'll look at raising the price of alcohol. That will go into paying for things that Measure 110 can't pay for, namely detox and beds, but also prevention.
I want to get back to Brenda. Maybe you can answer this. When Taylor was going through his addiction, how hard was it to find treatment?
It was nearly impossible. Taylor had a mental health and substance use disorder. And so because he had co-occurring issues, it compounded the situation. So when we would go to a mental health provider, they would talk about his drug addiction and vice versa. And we couldn't find treatment.
Dr. Andy, maybe you can answer that. Mental health goes hand in hand with addiction, and yet if you're seeking help, they say, well, take care of the mental health first, then we'll take care of the addiction. Don't we need programs that take care of both together?
Jeff, we do, absolutely. And tragically, there's been a structural mismatch here in the state of Oregon for decades, 2 decades at least, with respect to the demand for services and the continuum of care's ability to supply those. And when we're talking about a dual diagnosis level of care, we're talking about a highly trained workforce that we have, as a state, been unable to create, maintain, and ensure that folks have the ability to receive those simultaneous services. It's absolutely doable, but it's a highly skilled workforce. They're highly trained, and we need a strategy to quickly close that workforce gap.
Elise has a special guest here, and I want everyone to meet Terry. And Terry Anderson has a very tragic and painful story that she wants to share with everyone tonight.
Yeah, so Terry Anderson and I met, pretty recently within the past, month or two. And Terry knows firsthand what it's like to have, the impacts of the lack of beds that Emily has reported on, and the lack of treatment that you're talking about, and the policies in our community that is playing out in the addiction crisis that we see. So Terry has a child who has a substance use disorder. Terry also has a son who had a dual diagnosis, just like your son, who, yes, with mental illness and addiction. And she fought for a decade, an entire decade, to try and get her son into treatment and to force him into treatment, and she was never able to get him that help. And so in his paranoid schizophrenia, he ended up self-medicating on the streets of Portland with hard drugs. So Terry has brought something with her tonight, and I want you to tell me about what you're holding.
I'm holding my son. He finally came home after 10 years of fighting a system that didn't care. I was told time and time again by doctors in the ED, I don't want to take his rights away. I may be mistaken, but Joshua doesn't have any rights anymore. I don't have the right to see my son. He graduated with a culinary degree. He was an accomplished musician. Those rights have been taken.
Tell us how you found out that your son had died on the streets of Portland.
2 deputies showed up at my house. My other son came down and said, Mom, it was 1 a.m, Mom, you need to come to the front door. And I could just tell by Michael's look what they were going to tell me. I'm very thankful, and this may sound a little odd, but I'm very thankful it wasn't to tell me he had taken someone else's life, but that rather his suffering had ended.
And he was found outside the door of the Salvation Army right off Burnside, and he had been there for how long before they found his body?
When I got the reports back from the medical examiner, he had been there for over 40 hours with employees walking over his body, seen on the video cameras.
How does that happen in a city
People
like
are numb.
Portland?
They're numb.
We're numb to it. Lisa, you talked about that. The downtown business, we're almost becoming numb to it. It's nothing to see people laying there. I mean, how can we as a society continue to do that? You know, how do we do that? Sharon? I mean, 40 hours, someone's body laying there, and we're just stepping over it because, oh, that person's on drugs, whatever. We're just stepping over it. And this is the result.
Yeah, and I'd like to address something I heard earlier. It was nice to hear my son was in jail before, because I knew he wasn't in the cold. He wasn't being abused because of his mental illnesses. My son he wasn't a dealer. He had a personal amount of medication, and that's all it took.
Aaron Schmaltz, as a police officer, you see this every day. You know, has it increased? Has what we see on the streets increased in the last few years?
You know,
or has it always been there?
My dad was a drug officer in Portland for a long time, and I think the thing that's really frustrating listening to all of this, you heard from the professor from Stanford, we need a web. We need to ensure that services are not just one thing. There is no panacea to this problem, but there's also this idea. I'm listening to someone say what police should enforce, but the tools to do that come from the community telling us what we can and cannot do. The ability to interdict, the ability to go and seek out people and help them, but also for law enforcement, because we are the first to respond to so many different crises, but very often we are not the solution. But we have to have those partnerships. We have to be at the table. And I'm listening to the origin of this bill, but what I'm not hearing is that partnership existed at its origin, that we were hearing from the partners who were going to be the expected solution, that they would know how to do that work, that law enforcement would be able to have the tools to go and interdict, but then also get those people to help, that the treatment that was going to need to be in place, that those folks would have the money, because you can give someone all the money in the world, but if they don't have the resources or the ability to spend that money well, we're just watching people hurt.
Okay, Brian, you were a police officer for how many years? Decades. And when you hear this, and a mother who finds out her son laid in the doorway of the Salvation Army for 40 hours before his body was discovered, and someone who lost a son yourself.
As a father and a parent, it breaks my heart. and it's so tragic and unnecessary. And how we get to that place is the question. It's a state of pain. That really is what we're going through here, and it has become, somebody said it, where we are all numb, and we shouldn't be, and there's got to be something different done.
When we come back, let's look at solutions. How do we break out of that numbness? I mean, where morally do we say there's this thing of we don't want to bother someone, they're doing their own thing, but at what point do we draw the line between compassion and tolerance? Say, we've got to help you. It is not compassionate to let someone die on our streets like that. We're going to look at that. We're going to get some final thoughts, and we're going to look at ways we can move forward with Measure 110. What are some of the tweaks we could do to it? Something that would really make a difference. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
This is a Coin 6 Town Hall, a state of pain, Oregon's drug crisis.
He was aware of the deadly nature of fentanyl, and he took one pill.
He had been there for over 40 hours with employees walking over his body.
We've heard the heartbreak from parents and the frustration from leaders in our community.
I really feel that it is the main problem for our city. I know everybody blankets it in homelessness, and I feel the poor homeless that are really down and out are being blamed for what is truly a drug problem.
We are the first to respond to so many different crises, but very often we are not the solution.
All in all, they found that Oregon's addiction care system is actually half the size it should be to meet the current demand.
How do we close those gaps and improve Measure 110? We're looking for solutions. And welcome back to our town hall, A State of Pain, Oregon's drug crisis. We started our program tonight talking to Brenda and Brian Martinek, who lost a son, Taylor. And you're not letting Taylor's life be in vain. You've started something, you're pioneering something called Taylor's Law. Can you tell us about it? Brenda, we'll start with you.
Yes, so it's House Bill 2906. Which we refer to as Taylor's Law. And it's really to complete that package of support, that prevention, the treatment, and then also the ability for us to get drugs off the street. And so it's really about continuing to add more barriers for drug dealers to be able to sell and profit off of our most vulnerable people, people who are having a hard time getting into mental health and substance use treatment beds, people who are just getting out of jail and they're met with drug dealers on the streets. So we're really trying to help reduce the drugs that are on the streets, specifically fentanyl, anything that is going to result in somebody else having to bury their child.
Where is the law now, Taylor's Law, in the state legislature?
So Taylor's Law is in the House Judiciary Committee right now, being considered for a hearing, and we are asking the chair of that committee, Representative Jason Krupp, to give that bill a hearing so that we can bring in the many, many families that now are in the same boat that we are. Since 2017, because we don't have a law that holds people accountable for when they sell drugs to another person and they die. Measure 110, we can debate how that came out. We decided to legalize user amounts, as Anthony pointed out. That didn't take away the ability for us to enforce distribution laws and other amounts, but what we don't have is the ability for our prosecutors to prosecute someone for the death of another individual when they sold them drugs. And so that's where we're at. We need to get a hearing. We need to have that hearing scheduled by April 17th, or March 17th, I'm sorry. And we are trying to get meetings with Chairman Krupp and any of the other representatives that will listen to us. So far, we haven't had that happen yet, which is interesting because in 2019, we did get a hearing. We filled 2 hearing rooms with families that lost loved ones, and the vast majority of the people that testified there were in favor of that law. This law isn't about locking up people who have addiction disorder. That's what that would have put our son in prison, and that's not what we want. We want these people who are selling drugs for consideration, money, and preying on the vulnerable people, as Brenda said, to make money off of them and make money off their deaths and their addiction, and that's not okay.
Let's hear from Renee Gonzalez, City Council. When you hear that, how can we improve Measure 110, Renee? Some folks said maybe we put the cart before the horse when we pass this thing.
Yeah, well, a couple of structural weaknesses. We didn't roll out services when we decriminalized, and that gap, the order was inverted, so that was a fundamental error. Second, we said we adopted the Portuguese model, but the Portuguese model really prescribes certain behaviors and holds people accountable for not participating in addiction.
When you say Portuguese model, we're talking about Portugal. They decriminalized, but their system is much more robust with social services, and they hold the addicts, the people that are addicted to drugs, more responsible. They make them get treatment.
That's right.
We don't do that under this.
And there's also a social stigma associated with drugs in Portugal that people forget. Even when they decriminalize, there's much more social pressure to engage in addiction services. That was a structural weakness when we adopted Measure 110 here. What we do about it, how do we get out of it? Well, I think we can still embrace body autonomy. We can still embrace compassion for those who are struggling with chemical dependency, but not enable. And where we have really gone down the wrong path in the state of Oregon and the city of Portland is we enable horrifically self-destructive behaviors that is not just destroying an individual's life, but is destroying our livability in our city. And it's continuing to draw people into the city of Portland that are attracted to that lifestyle, that are attracted to the free access to very hard drugs. And we need a hard reset on that.
I want to get some final thoughts. We have about 5 minutes from as many guests. And let's start with Lisa Schroeder right there. Lisa, what would you like viewers to walk away with tonight?
Well, I just want to see consequences. I want to see the police get involved. They're now hands off, saying Measure 110, we can't do anything. No, it is still illegal to smoke meth on the street. It's still illegal to deal it on the street. If you see somebody, smack their hand. Start with somewhere and have some consequences.
Terrence, how do you weigh in on this? Final thoughts from you.
Final thoughts for me, and I said it once and I'll say it again, is if you see someone on the street struggling, if you see someone on the street standing by, even asking you for a dollar, don't shrug your shoulders, don't walk around, don't ignore them. For the simple reason that could be their deciding factor to end their life.
Interesting. Aaron Schmautz, Sergeant, what would you say you want viewers to walk away with tonight?
I just think the concept of accountability is a loving act, and ensuring that we have the ability to hold people accountable in a benevolent way and ensure that the second step, because the inputs are all different. If law enforcement interacts with somebody, we have to have somebody who can take care of them. If it's in the hospitals or wherever else, we can't just dismiss people and release them on their own and pretend that they're going to be okay. We're failing our community.
Crystal, you work with the folks on the homeless. I've seen the great work you do out there day after day. What do you want folks, when it comes to addiction, to walk away with tonight? We say we're in a state of pain.
I want to see infrastructure built out of that money. I see a lot of the 110 money going towards harm reduction, and that's amazing. We need it, but that's the defense. I want to see the offense. I want to see infrastructure where people who want to get clean have a place to get clean at, and not just detox. We have a new drug. They need stabilization after that.
Mike, how do you weigh in? Final thoughts.
So thank you for illuminating this conversation. And I just want to share, I just recently celebrated 15 years of continuous recovery. And that only happened because I reached out to friends, not because the system was supportive, even 15 years ago. You've heard a lot of reasons why it's hard to get access to treatment and to get into recovery. Do not let that be an obstacle if you are out there struggling, if you have a family member. Ask anyone in recovery, and 10% of Oregon's population identifies in recovery. Ask them, ask your doctor, ask the receptionist in your doctor's office. There are people that will help that are not in the system, but can get you into the system. Do not give up hope. Recovery is possible for you and your family members.
Emily, what would you want folks to walk away with?
Well, one, Oregon's addiction crisis wasn't caused by Measure 110, but by Oregon's long-running failure to address a growing problem. And now we have new funding, new leadership, and an opportunity to rethink and reshape our addiction care system and models to rise up and meet the challenge of today's complex and changing crisis.
All right. A few quick thoughts from over here. Sharon?
Yes, I think that we need to embrace what Mike Marshall had said, that hope and optimism that the Measure 110 foundered so badly because of failed leadership at the Oregon Health Authority, and it's unconscionable. We have new leadership at the governor's level and at the Oregon Health Authority. Rely on that, decrease fragmentation, get some data, have the conversation around civil commitment and involuntary treatment, because it's needed, and coordinate.
Dr. Andy, what would you like folks to walk away with?
Thank you, Jeff. We've got the right leaders in charge. We need a little bit more time. It's exciting to recognize that we are now at a time where everyone is focused on this issue. This is a public health crisis, an epidemic, and getting leaders together to develop a coordinated strategy and give Measure 110 and all of the other funding opportunities to scale behavioral health services across the state of Oregon is our time. And this is we can solve this. This is possible.
Okay, Shamia.
Well, I mean, we've heard it here tonight. We've heard about Taylor and Joshua. I shared about my mom and my brother. The effort to not grow numb means that we got to remember that everybody is somebody. That it's not just somebody laying on the ground. It's not just a data point or a number. That's somebody's son. That's somebody's brother. That's somebody's mom. It's somebody's grandchild. And I'm sure that your viewers tonight have people who they love, that they know the full person. They don't just see somebody who's experiencing addiction. Everybody is somebody.
Okay. Terry, a final word, and then we'll wrap it up. And I thank you for being here tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I think someone said about it, this system is enabling. And I very strongly feel that Portland, it's my opinion, Portland and the system that denied us for so long, they're responsible for the death of my son. We treat dementia. People are confined. They allow family members to take care of their loved ones with dementia. But with mental illness, once they turn 18, all bets are off.
I want to thank everyone for your nice comments here tonight. I know it was painful, especially for the parents that lost loved ones. Thank you all. Let's all try to be part of the solution. So tonight, if you or someone you know is battling addiction, we have resources posted at coin.com. You'll also find links to Emily Green's outstanding articles in the Lund Report on addiction and Measure 110. And I want to thank Terry Anderson and the Martiniks once again for sharing the pain and suffering of losing a child to drugs. I can't imagine. And thank all of you from us here at Coin 6 for being here in the studio, and thank you at home for watching. Take care.